Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 12th of June of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kiev, about different statements that were made by different Western politicals. We see it some kind of desperate in their words. For example, today German defense minister arrived in Kiev. Boris Pistorius wanted to get acquainted with the worsening situation at the front and with the air defense, and also to discuss further military assistance with representatives of the Ukraine government. So this is already the second visit of the German minister to the Kiev in the last 6 months. Furthermore, according to information we have today, Boris Pistorius stated that Ukraine would never get German Taurus missiles. I'll remind you, according to information we have and according to statements that were made by Zelensky recently, Germany is planning to establish production of analogs missiles on the territory of Ukraine, most likely in the western part. So then Ukrainians would be able to use some long-range missiles to attack deep inside of the territory of the Russian Federation. But at the same time, we see that Germany doesn't want to be a part of this. They don't want to give Ukrainians the missiles themselves. Another important statement today was made by Keith Kellogg, by the special representative of Donald Trump. Trump's special envoy Keith Kellogg has proposed a plan for ceasefire in Ukraine that would consolidate the positions of de facto parties. We call it a ceasefire on the ground. That means that land you are physically on is your territory. You hold it. That is your de facto control. It doesn't necessarily mean that de jure recognition, but de facto, yes. Your troops are there, they control that land. Then the return of the children and the prisoners, making sure that the ceasefire is sustainable in the long term, acceptable to both Ukraine and Europe. This is a very important part of the statement, because according to Keith Kellogg, he doesn't care whether the ceasefire is sustainable and acceptable to the Russian Federation. And then trying to get Russia back into the League of Decent Nations so that everyone can get their act together again. Then we can all live with the results of that peace for a long time in a balanced and predictable way. So this is the statement of Keith Kellogg, telling the truth, very interesting plan, and saying simply, according to him, Russia will stop right now along the current line of combat contact, and then the Western countries most likely will lift every single sanction, every single restriction that was imposed against Russia since the beginning of 2014 or something like this. So this is something like a deal from the Western countries that you can see right now. And telling the truth, I'm not sure that Russia will accept this, because the Russians are advancing along the entire line of combat contact. And according to information we have, the Russians in May of 2025 shown the best results ever since the end of the 2022. So the Russians managed to establish control over so many territories. The last time they shown the same results took place probably in 2022, maybe at the beginning of the special military operation. So from this perspective, I'm not sure that the Russians are going to accept this proposal. But anyway, if Russia ever accepts this proposal, obviously they will act the same way as they do with ceasefire. For example, the Ukrainians are saying that first ceasefire, then talks. The Russians are saying that first talks, first we need to handle with problems we have between Ukraine and the Russian Federation, and after we handle with every single issue, only then we're gonna see ceasefire on the ground. When talking about issues, first of all, the Russians are saying stop mobilization. So you, Ukraine, the Western countries, stop mobilization first of all, stop supplying Ukraine with weapons, stop providing Ukraine with reconnaissance operation, and only then we can talk about ceasefire. Most likely the Russians are going to do the same if they ever accept any proposal from the Western countries like this. First, lift any sanction, every single sanction, lift any restriction from Russia, and only then we will talk about your plan. But most likely the Western countries will never accept this, because they will act here the same way as they act with the ceasefire. First ceasefire, and then we will lift sanctions. Obviously this is not the case for the Russian Federation. But telling the truth, of course we are talking a lot about all these statements, about desperate situation, about talks, but we need to remember one important thing, that currently there's a very big, very huge prisoner exchange process. So basically, the Russians and the Ukrainians, for example, today, once again, they swap with prisoners. The Russians return their prisoners, the Ukrainians return their own prisoners. And there is very important and interesting detail about this process. According to information we have, this is already a third batch of prisoners that were exchanged between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine since June the 2nd, since the agreements reached on June 2nd in Istanbul. But the most important thing that neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians provided us the numbers, how many soldiers were returned back to Ukraine and how many soldiers the Russians returned back to Ukrainians back to the Russian Federation. So a very difficult but very interesting question. And for some reason, both the Russians and the Ukrainians decided to keep this information in as a secret, as a very, very huge secret. And telling the truth, and one of possible reasons why the Russians and the Ukrainians are not telling us about the number of prisoners is that both the Russians and the Ukrainians came to conclusion that it's time to swap prisoners by formula everyone for everyone. So maybe currently we are at the stage when the Russians decided to return everything back to Ukraine, every single soldier, and the Ukrainians decided to do the same. And when talking about this configuration, about this situation, obviously this might be the beginning of the entire ceasefire process. So anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next. But obviously this probably some mythic situation where the prisoner swap is very interesting. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground, and first let's talk about the northern directions. According to information we have, the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their positions to the south of the settlement of Kondratyevka, in the vicinity of the village by the name of Andreevka, and to the south of the settlement by the name of Oleksiivka. We came to this based on the videos that were published by the Ukrainian sources, and this is the video we're talking about. In this video we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russian soldiers in this area with FPV drones, with mortar systems, and with artillery. And as you can see, there are lots of episodes in this video, and at least 4 of them were geolocated. The Ukrainians attacked Russians in this point, at this point, at this one, and at this one. Based on this video and based on geolocated episodes, we adjusted the map in the Russian favor. So this is the situation by the end of the 11th of June of 2025, and this is the situation by the end of the 12th of June. But at the same time, we see that we haven't colored anything additionally. We just colored everything that was already marked as a contested area or the gray zone, which means that the Russians slowed down completely, and currently we have no gap. We have no gray zone or contested area between edge positions of the Russian Federation and the settlements of Khotin and Pisarivka, which is also very important, and which is also means that the Russians most likely stopped their offensive, and currently the Russians are focused on artillery strikes, FPV drone attacks, complete control over supply lines, and so on. Currently, we have no reports about additional attempts to attack in the direction of the second defense layer. The same situation takes place in the central area and in the eastern flank. We haven't received almost anything. Furthermore, according to information we have, according to pro-Ukrainian resources, the Ukrainians managed to repel every single attack in the area of Yunakiivka and to force the Russians to fall back outside of the village, so which is also very interesting. And telling the truth, if we compare this situation, this sumo direction between weeks, obviously currently we see completely opposite picture than we used to see a week ago, when the Russians were advancing almost every single day, and when we were coloring this territory in Russian favor almost every single day. Very weird situation, but when talking about the 12th of June of 2025, it seems that the Russians stopped their offensive operation in the Sumy direction, despite all talks, despite all updates that we get from different sources. And you know that this is not something new. You know that, for example, in 2024, we already saw this situation during the battle for the settlement of Volchansk. First, the Russians began taking one village after another, one town after another, but at some point, at some moment, when the Russians entered the northern part of the city of Volchansk, the Russians suddenly stopped, without any additional progress on the ground. And so maybe the Russians are doing the same thing in the area of Sumy. So currently it's very difficult to understand. Anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next, but obviously something big might happen. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kupyansk direction, where during the previous 24 hours the Russians managed to improve their positions to the west of the settlement of Dvorichna. And according to this article, according to these icons, as you can see, this information today was provided by pro-Ukrainian sources from Deep State team. So the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to take under control several tree lines and fields and a part of this huge forest to the west of the settlement of Dvorichna. So this is the situation by the end of the 11th, and this is the situation by the end of the 12th of June of 2025. Now let's talk about the central Kupyansk direction, and today we get very interesting update from the area of Zagryzovo and Kruglakovka. This morning several neutral mappers adjusted their maps in this area, and according to them, as a result of counter-offensive operation, the armed forces of Ukraine managed to restore control over several positions between the villages of Kruglakovka, Zagryzovo, the settlement of Lazovo and Novoselovskaya. So these fields and these strongholds were recaptured by the Ukrainians during the previous days, and this is very interesting. And first we adjusted and we colored this area as a contested area, but later pro-Russian resources published this video, and in this video we can see how Russians were attacking this stronghold with artillery and most likely with FPV drones, trying to destroy Ukrainian positions. And based on this video, by the end of the 12th of June of 2025, we colored this territory completely in Ukrainian favor. And this is very interesting because if you remember, several days ago we got report that Ukrainians announced evacuation on the Ukrainian side of the river Oskol in the vicinity of the settlements of Berezovka, Sionok, Vorontsovka, Fedorovka, Spodobovka, and many other towns and villages the towns in this area were obliged to forced evacuation. So, and we discussed, if you remember, that Ukrainians announced this evacuation probably with the purpose not to allow the Russians to continue offensive operation from the north of the city of Kupyansk in the southern direction, and from the settlement of Kruglakovka in the direction of Sinkova, and then along R79 road in the northern direction. So the Ukrainians basically created something like an area where they were able to concentrate and mass their troops with the purpose to stabilize the situation. And furthermore, now we got report that Ukrainians counterattacked in the area of Zagryzovo and Kruglakovka, and currently we see the situation that Ukrainians have chances to cut this Russian foothold along the river Voskol and to restore control over these positions. And most likely this is exactly what the Ukrainians are going to do, because the Ukrainians understand that the Russians continue improving their positions to the north and the northwest of the city of Kupyansk, and sooner or later the Russians will be able to create a foothold that will allow the Russians to continue offensive operation in the southern direction with the purpose to encircle the city of Kupyansk. So that is why the Ukrainians are trying to stay on the safe page, and for these purposes they can attack this territory with the purpose to cut Russian positions along the river Voskol. This can lead to several very interesting benefits for the Ukrainians. First of all, they will secure themselves from complete encirclement, and the second thing, the Ukrainians would be able to restore connection between the settlement of Barova, Kupyansk and the mainland, because now we know that the Russians are trying to advance from the settlement of Redkadup in the western direction, and let's say if the Russians are able to take the village of Lazovo under complete control, this can lead to complete collapse of Ukrainian defense and complete collapse of supply and support of the settlement of Barova. So that is why the Ukrainians can try to restore control with this territory. This will allow them to stabilize the situation probably for another month or several, probably maybe more than 1 month. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Constantinovka direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation in almost every single direction. First, let's talk about the southeastern flank, about the situation along the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. I'll remind you that yesterday we got reports that the Russians improved their positions in this area to the northeast of the village of Deliivka. We came to this conclusion based on this video that was published by the Russians. In this video we can see how Russian troops were moving along trenches towards Ukrainian positions, and this moment was geolocated exactly in this point. Based on this video, we colored this tree line in Russian favor and positions behind this tree line. When talking about several pro-Russian resources, yesterday colored almost everything in this pocket in Russian favor. And today we got another report that the Russians currently improve their positions to the west of the settlement of Kurdyumovka. We came to this conclusion based on this video that was published by the Ukrainian sources. In this video we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians in several areas of along the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal, and one of the episodes took place exactly in this area. Now we see that the Russians are about to finish the battle for this pocket, and as we discussed in the previous video, currently the Russians are tasked to establish complete control over everything inside of this pocket and to get the village of Bilogoro from the southeast, and then the Russians will continue moving further in the northwestern direction with the purpose to get as close as possible to the Russian contingent that are currently trying to break through Ukrainian defense in the vicinity of Pritiechina. So the Russians are trying to maintain their lines along the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal between the city of Constantinovka and the city of Bakhmut. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the area of Kleban-Byk pocket. The situation here remained tense for Ukrainian side. During the previous 24 hours, we got a lot of videos how the Russians were attacking Ukrainian positions in the village of Katerinovka and in the settlement of Kleban-Byk. We see lots of strikes, artillery strikes, we can see lots of FPV drone attacks, so lots of videos came from this area. Furthermore, this is not the only day, not the first day when we get so many updates exactly from this direction. Since the beginning of June, this territory was under very heavy fire, mainly with the use of drones and artillery strikes. And today we got very important updates. First of all, during the previous days, we discussed a lot the situation on the eastern flank of this area. The Russians during the previous days were trying to improve their positions to the northwest of the city of Toretsk with the purpose to establish control over this mine and over this dense network of the fortifications. And most likely the Russians are about to finish this. The main task of the Russians is to get this tree line along the railways between the city of Toretsk and the city of Constantinovka. So this is the primary target of the Russians. This will allow them to establish complete fire control over the only evacuation road for the Ukrainians on the line along Krivoy-Torets River. We are talking about 0522 road. And today the Russians shown us additional changes on the ground. We are talking about several very reliable mappers. According to them, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to break through Ukrainian defense to the northeast of the settlement of Romanovka and to take several tree lines and fields under complete control. So summarizing everything according to information from very reliable resources, the Russians established under complete control everything in this area. And when talking about this configuration, now we see that the distance between the edge Russian positions and the road 0524 is less than 1.5 kilometers, and the distance from the same positions of the armored force of the Russian Federation and Kleban-Byk water reservoir is a bit less than 4 kilometers. At the same time, the Russians are moving in the western direction from the city of Toretsk, and when talking about this situation, the distance between the Kleban-Byk reservoir and Russian positions is less than 2.5 kilometers. And obviously, it's clearly seen that the Russians are about to create another cauldron for the armored forces of Ukraine in this area. And something tells me that during the next several days, either the Ukrainians would try to counterattack the Russians with the purpose to stabilize the situation along flanks, or the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back in the northeastern direction and in the northwestern direction with the purpose to avoid and to escape this cauldron and not to be caught by the Russians. So this is the situation in this direction, and with this retreat, with this maneuver that Ukrainians can carry out in the very near future, most likely we can start counting, we can start countdown before the beginning of the final and major offensive in the direction of Constantinovka. Furthermore, during the previous 24 hours, we got very interesting number of updates from the line along N32 road. For example, in this video, we can see how Russians were bombing and attacking Ukrainians in this area. And you know that today, one of the Western neutral centers managed to calculate approximately the number of airstrikes exactly in this area, and according to them, the Russians bombed this territory during the previous 2 weeks more than 1,000 times using aviation. So the Russians are not just pummeling and reducing this territory to ruins. It seems that the Russians are trying to erase this territory completely. So according to these updates and according to this concentration of Russian fire, we expect something like a breakthrough attempt from the Russian side along N32 road in the northeastern direction, in the direction of the settlements of Stepanovka, Dovga Balka, Roskishne and Nimikolopolye. If the Russians are able to take under control these territories as a result of another fast lightning attack, this can lead to complete collapse of not just the entire Constantinovka direction, but probably of the entire Donbas direction. Now let's move further. At the same time, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the direction of Pakovsk agglomeration from the east. We know that the Russians are trying to attack the settlement from the area of Miralyubovka, further in the direction of the settlement of Nikolaevka, Novoekonomichno from the south and from the southeast. Furthermore, according to information we have today, the Russians finished the battle for the settlement of Malinovka. This information today was confirmed by pro-Russian resources who published this video. In this video, according to them, another Russian flag was established in the central part of the settlement of Malinovka. Several pro-Russian resources colored the village of Mirne under complete Russian control. And further, I would like to remind you that during the previous days, we got lots of reports that the Russians managed to enter the settlement of Koptiva and that there are very heavy clashes right now. So summarizing everything, the Russians are about to take in pincers the settlement of Novoekonomichno, and which will lead to complete collapse of Ukrainian defense to the east and the northeast of the Pakovsk agglomeration, and this situation can lead to operational encirclement of the armed forces of Ukraine, because from this configuration the Russians would begin attacks of positions of the armed forces of Ukraine from behind, and obviously the Ukrainians are not ready for this. So we see that we are entering the phase of the, probably not the beginning, but of the end of the beginning of the major battle for the Donbas arc, for the settlements of Pakovsk and Constantinovka. Now let's talk about the Dnipropetrovsk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. Today, as you can see, we got lots of icons from this area. The most important is that today the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation confirmed that as a result of clashes, the Russians established complete control over the village of Goryokhovo. This is the last village in this direction towards the settlement of Novopavlovka. Every single village in this area was taken by the Russians. Furthermore, according to information we have and according to the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the settlement of Oleksiivka. But at the same time, as we discussed during the previous video, this issue with adjustments of map in this area, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation haven't confirmed Russian control over the settlement of Zeleny Kut and Novoukrainka. Furthermore, several mappers adjusted or readjusted their maps back, and currently most of the mappers show this territory exactly as you can see in front of your screens. So the Russians secured the village of Oleksiivka, and the Russians managed to cross the river of Vovcha behind the settlements of Novoukrainka and Zeleny Kut and to establish complete control over this territory. And we have video that can confirm this. In this video that was published by the Russian sources, we can see how the units of 114th Brigade of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation established their flag in the most western part of this foothold to the west and the northwest of Novoukrainka and the settlement of Zeleny Kut. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map. So the situation in this area remains tense, and now we see that Ukrainians most likely were caught in Cauldron without any chances for evacuation. We are talking about those Ukrainians who are currently located along this complex network of the fortifications on the territory of the village of Novoukrainka and Zeleny Kut. The Russians cut the main supply line. Ukrainians have no chances to use this road, and the Russians, as we discussed a minute ago, took under control Goryokhovo, so which means that the Russians are increasing their pressure in this area as well. And for example, during the previous 24 hours, according to information we have, several groups of the armed forces of Ukraine tried to escape this cauldron using vehicles, and this is exactly the moment of this attempt, and this is exactly what kind of things, what kind of consequences Ukrainians will face if they decide to evacuate and to escape this cauldron during the daylight. The vehicle, as you can see, was destroyed by the Russian FPV drone, and right after first drone attack Ukraine vehicle, another one came to this area with the purpose to check the situation and to confirm that the vehicle was damaged and destroyed completely. So this video confirms that Ukrainians during the previous day or days were trying to escape this area using these routes of attack exactly in the middle between two Russian positions in the area of Goryokhova and in the area of the river of Volcha, but the Russians discovered the Ukrainian vehicle and destroyed it during the daylight. Of course, the Ukrainians most likely still have possibilities for evacuation during the night period of time, but when talking about daylight, no chances for successful evacuation. As you can see, and we have already discussed this, the Russians established complete FPV drone control over this territory, and most likely if Ukrainians decide to use these fields for evacuation, their losses would be very near around 100%. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in another settlement in this area. We're going to talk about the village of Kamar. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians improved their positions around the village. The Russians outflanked the settlement from the east and got as close as possible to the northeastern direction. Furthermore, as you can see, during the previous 24 hours, we got very huge focus of Russian artillery fire and FPV drone attacks in this square, which means that the Russians are trying to improve their positions and to attack this area first of all. These are the last settlements inside of the Russian side of the river of Mokre, Yali and the river of Volcha, and this is the next target of the Russians obviously, and most likely now the Russians will intensify their attempts to attack in this direction after the fall of Oleksiivka and after the outflanking maneuver of the settlement of Kamar. The Russians with this attack, with this direction, will try to outflank the settlement of Novopavlovka from the southwest as well. When talking about the Zaporozhye direction, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything special. I'll remind you that several days ago and during the previous days we got lots of reports that the Russians began offensive in the area of Orekhov, Mala Takmachka, that the Russians began assault operation on the settlement of Gulay-Polya. But as for the end of the 12th of June of 2025, nothing of this has been confirmed neither by the Russian nor pro-Ukrainian resources. Most likely there are very heavy clashes, but without any proofs about changes on the ground. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.